Welcome to another exciting adventure in nuclear medicine. Today's topic is going to be on single photon emission computerized tomography. Also subtitled Fundamentals of SPECT Imaging. So before we get started, I'd like you all to consider a couple of things. And to start off with, I'd like to compare SPECT versus planar imaging. What's the difference? Planar imaging takes a three-dimensional object and blends it into a two-dimensional plane, theoretically giving us a two-dimensional object. Perhaps the major problem with that issue is as we compress that image, what we'll discover is that if you, as an example, have a sulfur colloid liver spleen scan, and you've got the right lobe of the liver, and you've got some cold disease in the center of that liver surrounded by healthy tissue, theoretically you could miss it because there's too much activity surrounding it. SPECT, however, allows us to do tomographic analysis, and it displays the slices that are actually deep within the liver, allowing us to find that photopenic tumor. Generally speaking, planar imaging will usually have greater counts compared to SPECT. So, hey, maybe that's a problem. But SPECT kind of gets around that issue in that, number one, first, the resolution theoretically isn't as good because you cannot get as many counts per slice. You can't go for 1,000 count SPECT scan because every individual slice is the actual equivalency of what the resolution is going to be of any given object. So if you've got 64 slices and you can only go 20 or 30 seconds, you may get somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100, 150,000 counts. You're not going to get a 5 million count whole body bone scan. So counts becomes an issue. But that being said, where SPECT actually comes through is it comes through in its concepts of contrast. And we change image contrast with image counts by filtering those counts, by removing background, by removing noise. And the net result PET actually becomes a superior image to planar, especially when we're trying to look at objects that are deep, hidden, residing inside some heavy tissue organ, as an example. So the key issue is then if you do have disease buried deep within some healthy tissue, hopefully you should be able to see it. And as an example I have here on the slide, and colleagues compared SPECT to planar in the detection of coronary artery disease and concluded that SPECT imaging had enhanced reliability in localizing coronary artery disease. Again, because of its ability to, as I like to always say, slice and dice the material or the object that you're trying to look at. So let's first take a look at a planar image. While a planar image may be 64 by 64 or 128 by 128 matrix in a SPECT scan, I want to look at something really simple. We're going to look at a 5 by 5 matrix. And what I want you to realize here is that I have a single solitary hot source, and it's right in the center of my FOV, my field of view. And it collects a certain amount of counts in that pixel. And in that pixel, if you look at the display here, I'm saying that you've got 3 counts. Everything around it is 0, right? Because the hot object is only being collected in that center pixel. Now let's take a look at a SPECT scan. So in this scenario, assume that you're going to collect the data from 2 different point sources or 2 different directions. We're going to go anterior back projection and lateral back projection. Look at the diagram. And what happens when we get the sum of the arrays, keywords, sum of the arrays, because you've got 2 rays going on there, collecting all the way across on horizontal and all the way across on vertical, you get 3s across the board on both angles with the center dot being a total of 6. So we have a center point that we can focus in on. Let's continue on this thought. Now we have a gamma camera that goes 360 degrees around a patient. Although in this case, I'm again just showing you 4 different projections every 45 degrees. But in the end, what we actually are going to do is we are looking at the vertical and the horizontal angles, and we're noticing that the greatest center of concentration of activity is located in the center where these 2 arrays actually meet. So any activity outside the center of those arrays of the array should be considered background and must be removed. How to remove the background arrays? Well, that remains to be discussed in a little bit as we talk about filters. So hold on to your hats. Let's take it again one step even further. Now let us say that you have 4 objects in an area that you want to image, 4 hotspots per se. So in this scenario here, we take images every 45 degrees around the object. And as you can see, in any given angle, you're going to see between 2 and 3 different objects. You're not going to see all 4 because of the three-dimensional display of that object. As a net result, though, look at the sum of the arrays in the 3-dimensional image. Again, you have those cross-sectional arrays going around, and in the center of those rays are where those 4 hotspots or hot sources are actually located. You know, anything outside of that also has some activity, but it is somewhat less. Again, we need to figure out how to remove that. More to come on that. So now I want to introduce the concept of something that's referred to as back projection or back projection technique, also sometimes referred to as filtered back projection. So in this scenario here, what I want you to do is to consider that you got a patient in the center and you're imaging that patient at multiple different angles around the patient. And in a way, what you could be saying is that the detector head is a big movie screen and the patient is the projector. And that information, based on the angle of where that detector is or where that movie screen is that information that's being back projected onto the detector to be able to collect that information. Obviously, you're going to collect that information for a certain period of time, and it's going to be collected in the appropriate different pixels on those 3-dimensional assessments. But as it goes all the way around and collects that information, we are developing an assessment to be able to evaluate the patient and a three-dimensional aspect. So here's an example of what we just saw on the prior slide, and that is we have a patient here that's spinning around in an axis. I should also point out to you, this is really not a SPECT scan, but it is a PET scan. Now, that being noted, it's still the same basic principle, okay? It's still the same back projection that's going on that we're actually assessing here. And what we're looking here then is at the raw data as the patient spins around. And if you're curious, this unfortunate person or female has a breast tumor located right here that we're actually assessing. So, you know, we look at the raw data. What are we trying to do here? Once you collect all your information from your SPECT, you're going to do the raw data cine, and you're going to see a couple of things here. Did you correct or collect the correct area of interest? If not, reacquire. Did the patient move? If they did move, then apply motion correction. If they move too much and motion correction doesn't work, then again, unfortunately, you have to reacquire. And then the third thing is to make sure that there are no attenuation defects, something in the pocket, a necklace around the neck, some object attached to their body, like body piercing. All that material must be removed. If you see that accidentally and you missed it after you acquire it, again, it's probably going to have it's going to require you to then actually reacquire that data. So if the acquisition raw data is acceptable, you're now ready to go on and proceed on and actually process that information and generate your tomographic slices. So key issue here, whenever you do a SPECT, the first thing you always want to look at is the raw data cine. Make sure that all these properties fall within the appropriate assessment before you actually move on and process. And here's an example of this processed data. And you look at these tomographic slices, you can actually see the breast tumor right here as you go across. And you can also see other areas that have actually have metastatic disease. I believe this looks like it's probably in the liver. It looks like maybe we have some metastatic disease in the bone. Looks like we have some metastatic disease in the spine. Very unfortunate for this individual. So from our raw data and our processing, which we haven't talked about yet, you're going to then be able to display 3 different sets of slices. And you're going to be looking at coronal sagittal, and transverse. And what I've done here too is I've color coded that for you to actually be able to see which slice is which slice. This is really critically important that you're able to identify the physiology in the patient's anatomy based on the type of slice that we're actually generating from our tomographic assessment. So again, before we go into actual filtering and assessing and creating these tomographic images, we need to talk about image processing. So let's take a look here, image processing. The first thing I want to throw out at you is the concept about collimation. That's critically important. And in collimation, you know, what type of collimator should I use? Well, most of the procedures I'm going to assume that you're going to do is going to be with technetium. And in any type of technetium setup, you know, I really don't know what type of collimation you have, but you definitely want to apply a low energy, high resolution collimator. As we look over here, low energy, high resolution, actually we've got three types of collimator designs. We've got one that's called GAP, general all purpose. We've got high resolution, and we have ultra high resolution. What does that do for us? Well, in GAP, and actually in all three of these really, you can see the blue line represents the area where we're collecting true counts directly underneath the patient. But the further away you are from the patient and the shorter these little black septa are, as in the GAP versus high resolution, you notice here that penumbra, this angle right here, is significantly wider and larger, meaning that this area also comes in, you do collect information there. That data is called scatter counts. You really don't want scatter counts. If you have to have them, you want to have as few as you can have, because scatter counts is garbage information. It is not really where the scintillation is coming. Scintillation is coming from that area, but it's coming in on an angle. So you're not actually truly identifying the correct location of scintillation at the red line points of view. So from there, you can see how the penumbra actually shrinks if we go to high resolution collimator, and it shrinks even further if we go to ultra high. Again, the longer the septa, and also the smaller the borehole size. And all that being noted here, what I don't say here in the slide, and again is critically important, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is that the closer you are to the patient when you do a SPECT scan or a planar scan, it doesn't 2D or 3D, the closer you are, the better you are, the less scatter you're going to bring in. The further away you are from the patient, the more scatter you're going to bring in, the more possible blurriness. I don't know if blurriness is the right word, but the more effect on contrast is going to have, and you're going to lose contrast in that process. Final note here, if you do have an ultra high resolution collimator, according to the literature, what I've discovered is that you can actually improve your resolution by as much as 2 millimeters. So let's talk about the orbit, the SPECT orbit going around. We're talking again about acquisition parameters here. And the first thing that I want to throw out at you is the example of the difference between elliptical, and surgical orbits. If you notice here in the elliptical orbit in red, see how far away anterior and posterior are from this patient. And the reason for that is because you've got to be able to clear the shoulders or the edge of the imaging bed. So therefore, you in a circular orbit, when you are in the anterior and posterior position of the detector, you're significantly greater distance. That becomes a problem. However, if you do the purple line or a elliptical approach, in this scenario here, you can see that really are a lot closer, and we're utilizing closer distance, reducing the amount of scatter and improving and bringing in more true counts. My final thought on that, though, is that your imaging system should also have something referred to as body contouring. That even usually further improves on the acquisition process for the orbit. And that is that it's still more of an elliptical shape that it's going to form, but at the same time, it's still going to be closer to the patient because it's following the body contouring. And one final thought that I don't have on this slide, there are a few nuclear medicine procedures that actually require you to do a circular orbit. Certain brain scan procedures require that, in which case you have no choice. That's what you have to do. So make sure you check your protocol when you're doing SPECT of the brain. So what about matrix size? Another interesting component about acquisition, and I think it's critically important that we actually appreciate this and understand this. We have a choice, 64 by 64 or 128 by 128 matrix. So, as a general rule, I guess what I would sort of gear towards is the 64 matrix versus the 128 matrix. And this is why. Here's a formula, some calculations that I did in one of the classes that I give my students. And essentially what I've done is I've said, let us assume you do a 25-minute scan, SPECT scan on a patient, bone scan, goes 360 degrees around the patient, and you use a 64 matrix. Well, you know, when you do the appropriate calculation to determine what the actual image noise is, you discover that in that image, there's 31.4% noise. If I move it to a 128 matrix, and I say, okay, I'm still going to go 25 minutes, I am now increasing the amount of pixels by a fold of 4. What effect does that have on my image noise? Well, if I only go 25 minutes, my image noise jumps up to 89.1%. That's a significant increase. That's giving you a much grainier image. What's the difference when we do some simple ratio assessment? So I put in the numerator, I put down the 128, and the denominator, I put down 64, and there's 2.8 times more noise in a 128 matrix based on the 25-minute acquisition. The final thought is, well, okay, I still want to get better resolution. I want to use smaller pixel sizes. I'm still going to go with a 128 matrix. That's fine. If you want to try to also keep the noise to no more than 31.4%, what you will discover is that you have to now acquire a scan that's going to take you 70 minutes. So you're going from 25 to 75 to 70. How did I get to that? I multiplied 25 minutes by 2.8 times more noise. So again, let's go back and just reassess this planar versus SPECT image. And hands down, you're going to probably always get better overall resolution on a planar scan because you can go for more counts. But one of the mistakes that some people make when they think about SPECT is they think, oh, well, if I'm collecting 64 stops around a patient, 64 slices, I add up all the counts coming from all those slices, then my total counts is going to be greater than probably a whole body bone scan. And I would say, hey, you're probably right. But here's the problem with that analysis. And that is a SPECT scan is only as good resolution-wise as any one individual slice. So if you're going 20 seconds on a cardiac or 25 seconds on a brain scan, then whatever counts as in that individual slice is as good as what your resolution theoretically is going to be. So that to me is sort of a misconception. On another spin, and also something that is, in my opinion, critically important, is let's make an assumption that one of your PMTs, one of your Fulton multiplier tubes is, you know, maybe 7 or 8% off percentage-wise compared to all the other PMTs in your field of view or in your FOV. Well, that slight variation, if you're going for 64 slices, is going to be multiplied 64 different times. So that means you're exacerbating the defect when you do a SPECT scan. So what does that mean? That means, as I say down here, quality control of your flood field is critically important, And your variation for your integral and differential uniformities should be less than 3%. And which means then it has to be well tuned. And another minor thought in all that is you've got 2 detectors on a camera. You know, those 2 detectors are also independent in themselves. They're not exactly like each other. They're both 2 different animals, so the better angle, what else to say? They're 2 different objects. So each individual detector head must be tuned to less than 3% to give you quality information when you're trying to acquire data from a patient. So what about the amount of stops around a patient? Again, here we come to another I don't know, issue, but another thought process to bring together. So random transform identifies that an infinite number of projections around an object or stops will yield perfect replication. So what I did over here then is I said, well, I found this article and I noted what's the difference between 32, 64, 128, and 256 stops. And what I want you to realize then is that the fewer stops you have, also the greater the noise that is generated in this scenario. And the noise is something that you really don't want. So, gee whiz, what do? Rule of thumb, the amount of stops should be equal to the size of the matrix. That's just my thought process. So if you've got a 64 by 64 matrix on a whole body bone scan, then you're going to go for at least 64 stops all the way around the patient. And remember, what you're really doing is as the camera's moving around that patient, you're actually collecting data, sampling data of those photons coming off of that bone scan, and as it goes 360 degrees around. So it's a sampling, and your goal then is to try to generate a perfect replication. Well, that's probably not going to happen, but the more stops you have, the better off you are. So whatever you do, don't shortchange yourself on the amount of stops or the amount of angles. And then the other thing that I have here in the very, very last point, right down here, for this also reason, we also want to use things to filter what's going on here, what we refer to as the frequency domain, which I'll talk about in just a little moment or two, where we try to eliminate background and noise. So let's talk a little bit about spatial and frequency domain. So here comes another interesting point, and critically in understanding the concepts of SPECT. So data is acquired and evaluated on our CRT screen to assess data in the spatial domain. So when you're looking at your two-dimensional images, you know, whatever it might be, whether it's a spot view, whole body view, a lateral view of something, what you're really looking at is you're looking at spatial domain. So this digital image is designed or is designated, displayed to you by a matrix size, depending on the matrix. Those matrices composed of pixels, and those variation of counts within those pixels is going to generate an appropriate contrast for you to either evaluate normal looking tissue or diseased tissue based on the amount of counts collected individually. This actually gives you the contrast and resolution to be able to differentiate objects in the spatial domain. What we find out, though, is that if you want to eliminate noise, some low counts, I should say high counts come from high frequency, low counts is low frequency comes from background. So I'll say it again, low frequency background, high frequency noise. We want to eliminate those. We want to get rid of those in the either spectrum. We want to look at the center. You'll see a little bit more I'm talking about in a moment or two, but we want to look at the amount of true counts. Well, the easiest way to do that is not to manipulate them in the spatial domain, but is actually to manipulate these things in the frequency domain. So therefore, we need to take our spatial data and convert it into the frequency domain so that we can remove background and noise. In order to do that, we have to convert, obviously, spatial to frequency. And it is mathematically converted into frequency domain by an application referred to as Fourier transform. Images are then filtered, the background is taken out, the high frequency noise is taken out, and then it is then reconverted back into, or reconvoluted back into the spatial domain for our assessment to see if there's disease, normal tissue, etc. So all that being said, let's now take a look at filtered back projection. This is the process in which we are going to make our images be more acceptable. So I generated this image, this diagram here, because I think it gives you a really good overall explanation of sort of what filtered back projection is actually really doing. Go back to what we talked about earlier, where we have that hot object in the center of our SOV. I'm sorry, FOV. And here it is right here. And we're looking at spatial domain, you know, and we're actually looking at just a planar image. Now I'm going to take that acquisition, I'm going to go all the way around that patient. right? And or oh, I should really all the way around that hot spot. And look what I end up getting. I end up getting something that looks like this. Look at all some of the arrays. And as you get closer to the center, you get more and more activity. And then in the center of that activity is the hottest amount. So if I take a profile assessment and I go right across this here and I evaluate what the count distribution is, what I'm going to see is a peak here, lesser activity here, and no activity here. So as it crosses over, jumps into the red zone, light red, pink zone here, it pops up. And then when I hit the hot zone, it pops up even further to where the center of that object true activity is. What do we have here? Well, we have what we refer to as a lot of we have a lot of low frequency data around here in the array. So if I apply a ramp filter, which is a high pass filter, what that does is that eliminates the low frequency and keeps the high frequency. And when I do that, so we call it a high, also referred to as a high pass filter, ramp. That's what a ramp filter is. So what does that do? That eliminates a lot of the array. And we end up with an object over here that looks very similar to the original object over here. And again, I did all this in Photoshop. So I mean, and purposely didn't want to make it perfect because it's not going to look perfect, but it's going to look close to. And so you end up seeing this object here after you've eliminated a lot of those arrays. I do another cross assessment profile across this area to look at the count distribution. And this is what I end up seeing here. So frequency domain, high frequency removed is down here with the filter assessment. And here is actually here's the actual assessment of that diagram looking at the spatial domain. So another look at that hotspot. Again, here we have this is the actual true MAC daddy. We have a 360-degree SPECT acquisition around a point source. And first we have something referred to as unfiltered back projection. This tends to give us a more blurred object. As the camera goes around the patient, it gives us background, it gives us blur and that kind of stuff. And when you do the sum of the arrays, this may be really more of what we really actually see. And what we again want to do is remove those high frequencies. Those low frequencies. And one way to do that then is to again, do a low frequency, remove low frequencies by filtering the back projection and then giving our filtered back projection. And in so doing, we end up something that looks a lot more like a point source over here. So when we do our profile analysis, we have the blurring out here. We have the more true counts here. You can see that the dotted filter back projection actually appears a lot more significant. And this is really what we theoretically want. Object to activity or object activity versus image contrast. So here we have a formula where we've got the contrast of the object, and then we have the contrast of the image. So you've got two different variables, and we're going to do a comparison. Notice we got kilobecquerels per centimeters cubed. So we're actually looking at a three-dimensional object, and then over here we have we actually have the image in counts per pixel. So similarity, how close are they? That's what we're trying to evaluate. And all that being said, spatial domain has the ability to see the object depending on the amount of activity being emitted by that object. And that, again, variation of activity within an object or objects is going to give us or define the different types of contrast within that image. That being noted, realistically, I like to evaluate a grayscale. And when we look at a grayscale, a 256 gray or 2 to the 8th, there are 256 shades of gray. The human eye can only see somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 variations within the grayscale, just a point of interest. But in order for us to differentiate an object, we have to see enough variation in counts and between the surrounding voxels and pixels. This variation of counts and our ability to see that actually then it defines our ability to see the appropriate image contrast. And by filtering and removing noise and removing background, we improve the contrast of that image. Modular transfer function. Another interesting point of view. So MTF, as I'll refer to it from now on. So an MTF actually looks at the spatial domain, and I like to say that it looks at also the frequency domain. It looks and assesses the frequency domain and the spatial domain and gives us our ability to say, well, how well can I see that object? All right, so an MTF will have a value of anywhere between 1.0, where it's completely visualized, you see everything crystal clear, and 0.0, where there's a complete loss of data. You can't see anything. So that being noted, we relate this to the graph over here, the MTFs that are being displayed, and the frequencies that are located over here. So essentially, in this range here, you could actually say you've got an MTF that goes straight across. You see everything, right? And over here, you have a change in frequency, but the MTF doesn't change. So you got complete 1.0 visualization. Well, that's not realistic. As the object gets smaller, it's going to tend to drop down and produce an MTF that looks like this, meaning this is what the imaging system actually can visualize. And it can visualize in multiple different MTFs. The smaller the object, as we roll down the MTF, then the more oscillations that we will discover or actually see or not see, depends on how small it is. But the greater the oscillation, the smaller the object, the higher the frequency as we continue on down this ramp and this path. So according to the article that I picked on here, what they're trying to tell us is we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different frequencies. We have the image here, we have the object here. This is what is emitting. And I think what you can really appreciate in the very smallest of objects, it's still an object, but what we image is nothing but a straight line. It's too small. There's too much noise. You can't see it. It's somewhere down here in this lower end of the MTF or the filter, the modular transfer function. Once we've filtered out the noise and we've filtered out the background, we can then convert the image, I said earlier, back to its spatial domain, so that we can visually assess and also quantitatively, hopefully, analyze whatever information we're looking at. And this is even really a better object, because I think this makes things kind of like focuses all in to be able to see really what's going on. So here is my MTF. This is what the imaging system can actually visualize and see as the objects. And again, large objects over here, smaller objects over here. Note also in this scenario that no matter what you see, you're always going to see noise. All right. And this is also lower oscillations. And these are greater oscillations as you continue going out further out here. So over in this end, we have larger objects. We also have background, the overall shape of the object. Over here, we've got the object of information. That is what we really want to see. And then down here in this end, if you go over to this area over here to the right of the red MTF, theoretically, we can't see that. That is beyond our ability based on the design of that curve. Where the curve meets the noise, it becomes nothing but noise. You totally lose the object. So this is the confluence right here where there is the end loss of any resolution. So at this point where my arrow is right now would be the smallest object that you could see, or just above where my arrow is. And yet another way to, again, look at spatial versus frequency domain. Here I have a bar phantom, and this is probably what is actually the summation of all the frequencies, but I like to break them down and say, well, what is it we're really looking at? So what I want you to realize is the larger bars, or the largest bars, has this oscillation or frequency, and then as you go smaller bars, you get more oscillations, a higher frequency, and so on, with the smallest bars being here and being a 0.13 at this value, or at this point. So again, spatial domain, frequency domain, okay? So then in the parameters of frequency, we like to look at the object that we're actually visualizing. Here is the MTF going down here, theoretically. This is the actual object. Here we have the I should say really the MTF curve of where our imaging system might be able to see, but here's what's actually being displayed in the object. Notice it's also bumpy too. It's not it has bump ups and downs. And again, the reason for that is because the statistical distribution of counts being emanated from the patient. So in image one is the object and its size and the amount of activity which is being displayed. Image two is with the MTF. This is what our imaging system should be able to see. 1.0 up here, 0.0 down here. Number three shows us where the noise is. Noise is always inherent in any imaging system. Obviously, the more counts you have, the less noise there is. But noise is based on the lack of counts that are present in a system. And then number four, I blended 1, 2, and 3 to kind of overlap everything so we can really see where everything falls. So here, if you look over the red line over here, what we'll note then is that we can clearly visualize what's inside the MTF, but out here is beyond, and again, it's still part of the object, but it's beyond our ability to see that because it's on the right side of the MTF. And when we develop something referred to as a power spectrum, where we truly blend everything all together, this is what we see as the culmination of 1 through 3 blended into one specific power spectrum. And yet again, I hope I'm not belaboring the issue too much, but I just think this again is an important concept to realize. Up here, we have a bar phantom that's kind of like used in radiology. And what I'm trying to show you here is that here, as we have larger objects, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then finally you lose it in A. You really can't see the smallest objects. Well, if I were to convert that into a frequency domain, it might look something like this, where again, down here, they're so small or significantly fast oscillations, and there's also really nothing but noise. It's lost within the noise. If I were to plot that on an MTF, it might look something like this, where you see everything here, and as it's going further down, you're slowly losing more and more ability to really see that object until finally, again, it's lost. And then I come back with the, gee whiz, I wish life were always like this, that I wish I could see everything there is to see. That would be the red line, right? And then you have the true reality of what the blue line MTF is. You know, and another thing that I do for my students sometimes is, you know, a student will be sitting 25 feet away from me, and I'll hold up a notebook or some writing on a piece of paper, and I'll hold it up and I'll say to the person in the back of the room, can you see this? Can you see what's on this piece of paper? And they say no. Well, that's because their MTF is 0.0. All right, just a thought. So we can theoretically even equate that to today's reality in our eyes and our eyeballs. Nyquist frequency, another concept that we need to bring into our array of understanding the frequency domain. And an NF, for Nyquist frequency, the important thing to appreciate that is that it has a definition. Our Nyquist frequency maximizes our best resolution of what we can see in an object. So if you're below your Nyquist frequency, you're not maximizing the amount of your visualization, you're actually below the MTF. If you maximize your MTF, then you are maximizing your ability to see everything and anything that is possible within the appropriate imaging system that you have. But you don't want to go beyond that. That creates something called alacing. And I'll talk about that in just a brief moment. So coming back over here, here's the formula for Nyquist frequency. Notice that no more than 1/2 oscillations can fit in any one pixel. Anything beyond that causes alacing. So maximizing your Nyquist frequency, you can maximize your ability to resolve your smaller objects based on that imaging system. So we come over here and we look at this data. Here is maximization of Nyquist frequency. 1/2 of a cycle, the other half of the cycle, half of the cycle, half of the cycle. And down here we have pixel, 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 pixel. And then what I did is I said, well, let's generate, what would alacing actually look like from a frequency domain? So here we have a 1.0 cycles per pixel. And as you can see, we've crammed in an entire cycle. Oh, gee whiz, I want to put in more information so I can see more. Well, what that does is that tends to kind of like a overlap our data, which I'll show you in just a moment. It doesn't help us. It makes things actually worse. So, but first, let's take a look at what it might look like in a nuclear medicine study. This article here represents what a lacing would look like. And I don't totally agree with this article because it says that 16 views, 32 views, 64 views. I think this has more to do with our ability to put in enough slices to actually see this image. But the article says that a lacing might look similar to this. On the other hand, I have a digital camera over here that again looks at smaller and smaller bars, and I've cranked up my lacing to actually generate a lacing. And what you can see here is it's overlapped to where this bar here is over here, and this bar here is over here, and so on. So it actually distorts the image. Again, you don't want to go over 0.5 cycles per second. 0.5 cycles per pixel. And then, so what I said is, let's find some other information out there other than nuclear, because I really couldn't find a lot. And here's an example of an MRI scan. So an MRI, this looks normal. What they did here is they applied a lacing. And what I want you to note is up here is missing, and down here is popping into it. So the front of the skull is pushing in to the bottom of the skull, or I should say posterior I should say anterior is coming into the posterior realm. Obviously, this information here with a lacing is probably non-diagnostic from an assessment standpoint. So if I were to calculate the Nyquist frequency, it might look something like this. And that is what I've done is I've taken a 38.1 cm by 38.1 cm camera, which has that's its SOV, and I've done a 64 by 64 matrix. So the question is, I need to calculate the size per pixel. So we come over here, and if I take 381 millimeters divided by 64, I come up with 5.95 millimeters per cycle, okay? We then go back to our Nyquist formula, 1 divided by 2 times D, D being the size of the pixel. And here's the actual calculation. So my maximum frequency that I want in order to also prevent a lacing is at 0.084 cycles per millimeter raised to the -1. That being noted, the other thing that I stumble across when I look at the different manufacturers, my final bullet down here, is that this is the easiest way to assess and know that this is what this is the maximum for Nyquist frequency. You don't want to go beyond that. But all our different camera companies out there crunch the numbers slightly different. So this value is going to be slightly different. It's not going to always represent or look at as in cycles per millimeters to the -1. And so based on whatever GE is doing, or Siemens or Philips, you need to find out how they define Nyquist frequency. But again, what I have here, to me anyway, is the most simplest form of defining maximum Nyquist frequency in cycles per millimeters raised to the -1. Now we can talk about image filtering. To start off with, the one thing we may want to do in filter back projection is actually pre-filter. And why might we want to pre-filter? Well, the reason why I might pre-filter is an example shown here, where you've got, again, a profile analysis going across a flood field, and you can see it looks a little spotty, right? And from that, you want to look what the count distribution is across this surface, and what you see is a rather jagged surface. Well, if I apply a 9-point smooth filter to this, where it takes the center pixel and averages all 9 pixels, including the center, to one actual value, and does that for each pixel, then you're going to get something that looks more like this after the 9-point smooth has been applied. So that also will reduce a little bit of noise, a little bit of variation going on. So our goal then, as we prepare to filter the image, is first of all to note that we want to remove background, we want to remove noise. It's important to realize that there are some filters that are low pass filters. A low pass filter removes noise. It removes the opposite of what it is, where a high pass filter removes background or low frequency. Again, low pass filter removes noise or high frequency. There's also something I've stumbled across in the literature, but I've never found one, and that is something called a band pass filter, where it's supposed to remove high and low frequencies. But as I said, I've never really seen it. We come over here and we look at, again, another MTF. And what main thing I'm trying to appreciate here is, again, here's our noise, right? This is our image resolution, our ability. Over here, we have our large objects and our background. Over here, we have our smaller objects as we go out along the resolution scale here. And where we meet right here, again, is the spot in which we can no longer see any activity or any object because it gets lost to noise. So the closest thing I have to a bandpass is something referred to as windowing. What is windowing? Well, windowing is where you apply a low pass and a high pass filter together, and in hopes of then removing your low frequencies, removing your high frequencies, and maintaining that data or information that would be classified as your true counts. So here we have panning, which is low pass. Here we have ramp, which is high pass. I apply them both together, and this is the area that we're actually going to be able to reconstruct to get our slices and dices, our coronal, sagittal, and transverse images. It's those middle frequency that theoretically should contain our true counts. So let's look at a couple of variables then, besides windowing, when we actually assess and evaluate and manipulate frequency. The first one is referred to as critical frequency. And we're more specifically looking at a critical frequency of a Butterworth filter. In this example here, what it shows us a critical frequency of 0.2, 0.4, and 0.6. And as I increase in my critical frequency, I'm then bringing in smaller and smaller objects that I can actually then resolve or visualize after I've done processing. The kicker here, though, is to make sure that I don't go beyond 0.5 cycles per pixel. So in my display or analysis, one of the things that I try to focus on is saying that in my scenarios here that I've generated for you, is that you really don't want to go beyond 0.5 cycles per pixel, because if we go out here, then we're creating that Alacine artifact. We're causing these things to overlap. Again, something you don't want. And here is some data that I stumbled across on the web that shows you the change of the critical frequency. And most important thing that I want you to grab from this image is that the 0.2, which is here, has a very, over here, has a very blurry image. And as I move further out, that blurry image gets sharper, sharper, and sharper. So at this point, this is the sharpest. It is more noisy. This has more noise in it. It has smaller objects. This is more blurry. This has more background in it. And again, background over here, small objects down here. Blur, sharp, grainy, fuzzy, okay? Next thing, order. When we adjust the order of Butterworth, again, we can adjust our ability to actually improve our image resolution after we've applied the appropriate order parameters. And what you can appreciate from this then is that an order of 2 greatly brings in smaller objects, where an order of 8 reduces those smaller objects, but greatly increases our ability to see larger objects. One could also say that an order of 2 images are going to be more grainy, they're going to be more pixelated, where the red order of 8 is going to be more blurry, more fuzzy, more background. And notice here too is Nyquist. So let's bring in cutoff frequency and we'll pull this all together. So in Nyquist frequency, if this is a scenario or an issue here, let's say this is Nyquist right here, I want to cut this off at this point. But If I use an order of 2 in the process, all these larger objects, or actually the smaller objects in here are then actually getting visualized, but I'm chopping it off at 0.5 cycles per pixel. Whereas if I do the red one, which is actually an order of 8, look at all the data that I'm missing. I'm stopping this off. It ends down here somewhere, maybe just before it gets to 4. So I don't want to do that. So yeah, the order of 2 and a cutoff of 0.5 would be most ideal, because in the end result, we're going to reduce the amount of noise, we're going to reduce the amount of background, we're going to prevent aliasing, and the net result is an overall improvement in image contrast. And here's an example of cutoff frequency. Doesn't quite look like the design that I had, but again, you can appreciate the different venues here. Again, you can see where over here, 0.14 is more blurry, and then 0.822 is definitely a lot more sharp. So let's apply windowing, and let's kind of again generate another diagram that I put together for you all. And what I want you to realize is I've tried to show you where is background, where is true patient data, where is noise. So background is at this end, is at the lower end. Noise is inherent throughout the entire system. And then true information, true counts, patient data that we want to evaluate is this area right here. So if I apply the 2 best filters, I want to maximize my ability to remove background, remove noise, and at the same time, maintain as much patient data as possible. Now, before I hit the next click on my mouse, note one thing. We're never able to really see this whenever we're processing. This is an artist's rendition of what we're doing theoretically to enhance image quality. So here's an example of an inappropriate assessment or inappropriate manipulation of filters. You've got the ramp over here, that looks good. We've knocked off that background. But the Butterworth, we've maintained patient background, but we've lost all this information. Not good. However, if I use the ramp and Hanning filter, I am now maintaining, bringing in as much of the patient data as possible, still cutting off some noise over here, and at the same time, cutting off background. Let's take a look at other filters. First of all, I wanted to give you a rendition of what these filters look like. I found this slide. I was kind of really surprised. It shows you where the MTFs fall, and also in relationship where the cutoff. It doesn't really. I'll take that back. It doesn't necessarily show us the MTF. It shows where the cutoffs are with the different filters, and then you could associate an MTF with that. But there's only one high pass filter. There's a myriad of low pass filters, and then there's something called the Shep-Logan filter. And even they say it's classified as a low frequency, but really isn't, because look how much extra higher frequencies it actually brings in a lot compared to the other low end frequencies. They're all way down here. So, but the literature classified it as low. So that's why I put, is it, question mark. Filters that can actually do what they refer to as filter restorations. So this concept is to improve your low count image by restoring counts in its general definition. The one that I have on display here is referred to as a METS filter. And essentially all the METS filter does is it inverts the MTF. So it flips this around the other way and causing it to have a slightly different look as we see over here. Another filter is something called the Wiener filter. And this one, its goal is, again, in this scenario, it is a little different. This wants to filter out noise by assuming that noise and true counts are linear in their relationship. So in an attempt via the Wiener filter to eliminate noise, it applies a statistical concept referred to as minimum means squared error. And here is ramp versus Wiener filter to kind of give you an idea of what's happened. What you can see here is that it's eliminated some of our noise that's inherent in this system, and actually gives us a slightly better visualization of the different photo deficient areas found within this JZAC phantom. Three-dimensional imaging, or creating a three-dimensional image. Cross-sectional profiles is essentially what happens here. So sometimes you may actually look at some, in this case, this is a heart, and you're going to say, okay, so how do I actually get an image that looks like this? Well, what the system does is it looks at the graph that we see here, and it sets a threshold, which are these purple lines. When the activity builds up on this side and it hits that threshold, it throws in an increased uptake of pixels. It shows a darker, it shows actually in this case really a brighter pixel. So that becomes the edge of the object. It then goes to the other end, and when it hits the same level of threshold, it then slaps on, or it stops the actual object. So essentially it's looking for the surface and it's trying to define the surface of that object. So it does it pixel by pixel, going all the way across. Here I have 4 different spots on a short axis showing you where it's actually trying to draw that information. Again, giving you the idea of where these thresholds are actually set, so that in the end, you end up with an object that looks like this. And also looks like this. So this is our final object. On the other hand, we could also do this with a brain scan. And this three-dimensional imaging can also be referred to as volume rendering. And in this scenario, we're looking at an actual brain scan at its different angles. Pretty cool, I think. And I think it's great to actually assess a brain in this fashion. There's only one issue that I see in it, and that is what happens if the disease is deep within the brain, right? And it does not extend to the surface of the brain. Are you going to miss disease? Because I think you would. So again, surface rendering, volume rendering, an interesting program that you all are probably utilizing at your facility. Image filtering. So an image filtering is something referred to as a Chang filter. It's not in a scope in this lecture to talk about attenuation correction with CT and PET, or CT and SPECT. But for the general concept of SPECT, I do like to throw in the Chang filter and how that works. So Chang makes the assumption that there is only one form of linear attenuation going on in an object, which means that it's the same throughout. And in the one area of the body where there is really no change in significant change in that linear attenuation is going to be in the brain, right? Whereas if you want to image the heart and you want to apply Chang can't do that, because in the heart you've got heart tissue, then you've got lung, that's different attenuation. You got bone, that's got different attenuation. You've got blood, fat, muscle, that has different attenuation. So it doesn't really work. But in the brain, essentially the tissue in the brain is all pretty much closely the same. So what do we do to apply Chang? Well, first, another thought is, why do we apply Chang? Well, another reason why I apply Chang is that in this object, activity is lost in the center because of the Compton scatter and photoelectric that are going on as these photons try to leave the brain and hit our gamma camera to collect that scintillation. Well, the deeper that photon is within the brain, then the fewer get out. So there tends to be a loss of resolution based on that. So in a brain scan, if we apply a Chang filter, then by applying the Chang filter, we can equalize that effect, where Chang will then add counts, especially those counts that are coming more so inside deep within the brain tissue. So what does it do? Well, in order to be able to do that, here we have a slice of a brain scan. We put an ROI around it. We then apply the correction map that we see over here. And from there, again, we have the original data, and then we have the new data. So original transfers, attenuated corrected transfers. And while there isn't a lot of difference, There is some. I asked you to look at the center of the brain, and you can see how now they're definitely slightly more intense, more activity is actually being noted from that. So this is an example of attenuation correction when you apply the Chang filter. And in our tomographic slices, we talked about this earlier, but I thought what I would do is give you the idea of what does the heart look like, what does the rest of the body look like, and what I'd like you to appreciate, again, you've seen this image, transverse, coronal, and sagittal. Again, it's all color-coded. But the heart is off on an angle. It's sitting on a degreed angle here, and therefore we don't use transfer, coronal, and sagittal on a heart scan, but we use vertical long, horizontal long, and short axis. And if you look at these planes, you can see that the blue plane is the vertical long going up, is going, I guess, really dorsally and vertically into it's going through the heart. We then have short axis, it's going from apex to base, and then we left to right, we have horizontal long, which is this black, the black angle right here. And actually, if you spun this around and you straighten this out along with the actual regular anatomy of the body, you could actually then rename vertical long to coronal. You could rename short axis to transverse, and you could rename horizontal to sagittal. Finally, if you want to know where the areas of the heart are located, I have them identified here as to the different sections of the heart based on the type of projection and with the letters A through G. So I have to throw in a little bit of information about iterative reconstruction, because this is the newer method of actually doing tomographic imaging, I should say really finding another way to slice and dice everything. So our goal in IR, iterative reconstruction, this new other method, is to estimate the true counts in each individual pixel or voxel. And the advantage of IR over filter back projection is, number one, is an attenuation map can be employed, which means that we can actually do a CT attenuation correction and apply that right into the image to improve our data. We can also estimate the radiopharmaceutical distribution be applied. You can still use back projection used in its process. You can improve data, allowing for better quantitative analysis. And finally, there is no star defect. On a disadvantage, it takes longer to process and you need greater computer time. So what does filter back projection to iterative reconstruction look like? Well, this actually has 511 keV photons coming out of it. It's a PET scan, and PET almost always, if not always, uses iterative reconstruction because there are so many different hotspots in a PET scan that it tends to create a lot of arrays. Notice when we apply iterative reconstruction, there are no arrays. Is there better contrast in this? I think there's even slightly better contrast in the iterative reconstruction when compared to filtered back projection. So trying to give you a simple explanation of what IR actually is, we first need to evaluate or notice that you've got 2D or 3D, I'm sorry, you have 2D matrices with either 64 or 128 matrix, usually 64 stops or 128 stops if you're going 360 degrees around the patient. So first of all, you start off here, you have your initial data that's required. The system is then going to do an initial guess estimation of what it's actually evaluating, assessing. Again, we're starting now to work with the IR approach. It then takes this data over here, plops it into where it's called an estimated 3D. So it's the original estimated 3D assessment of what we're actually looking at. From there, it applies the patient-specific attenuation correction map. So if you have a CT scanner, it'll apply that. It'll throw this into here. So it'll give you, again, correcting for the counts that are being emanated from the center of the body. It also applies imaging physics in its assessment, which is also a good thing. And from there, once it applies all these things, it looks at the estimated projection and the measured projection. So really the estimated projection and the estimated prediction at a 2D level, slice by slice, is actually then assessed and looked at, compared, and a differential is created. So it's usually a minus or a plus to the individual voxels and pixels that are on the scan. And in the differential, then it comes up with a 3D estimated matrix error or error matrix. That error matrix is then applied to the prior estimated 3D matrix. So it's either going to subtract or add counts pixel by pixel, voxel by voxel, creating a new 3D estimated image. It then repeats itself and does it again and again and again and again. And hence the word iterative reconstruction. So multiple iterations is the goal. And in the process, what we're trying to do is find out what is the true counts per voxel, three-dimensional pixel per voxel. So there are a couple of different ways that we can look at IR. IR is also known as expectation maximization, an overall terminology. And in one of the IR approaches is something called maximum likelihood, or MLEM. And MLEM actually, again, goal. They all IR techniques, the same goal, and that is to generate what is the true counts. So what it does, it looks at all projections, each one at a time. You got 64 projections, it's looking at each individual projection going all the way around and assessing the correction matrix and subtracting, adding counts in that circular fashion that we just talked about. And it's going to do it anywhere between 50 to 100 iterations. So imagine you've got not 64 by 64 stops, you've got 128 stops. That's even significantly more. The next jump then is to look actually at what we call the ordered subset, or OSEM. This is the more popular approach. And what it does there is, if we have 128 projections, it breaks them down into subgroups. And there's usually, in this scenario here, there's 8 projections per subgroup, and there therefore is 16 subgroups. So what it'll do then is it'll process each individual subgroup individually, so it actually takes less time to actually process that data. And usually it can come up with a pretty good guesstimation of what the true counts are within around 15 or so iterations. Maybe a few more, maybe a few less. We're going to take a look at an image, and you can make the assessment of that. So OSEM is the preferred method. The end results of OSEM also is that it'll save us some time. And of course, as I said, it's the preferred method. So here's an application of OSEM. This is a cardiac scan with 1 iteration up to 20 iterations. And I guess what I'm going to ask you to do here is look at iteration 10, 15, and 20 and tell me what you think. Which one do you think? Could you stop at 10? Should you go to 15? Should you stop at 15? Should you go to 20? I don't think there's that big of a difference between 15 and 20, in my opinion. But I'll let you all be the judge of that. A couple of other quick notes here is that each iteration does generate more noise. And think about more noise because it's finding more and more true counts. This is also referred to as noise breakup phenomenon. Too much noise can also reduce image contrast. And for that reason, what often will happen after you do an OSEM processing or filtering, you're then going to go back and you're going to post filter by doing another smoothing filter on the post filtered data. So here are some examples. I don't ask you to really focus in on the numbers, but I ask you to focus in on where the actual curve is located. How was this MTF curve generated with the appropriate filter? And, is the image fuzzy or is it grainy? Can you explain why it's fuzzy or grainy? And so let's look at the very first one. And again, these are extremes that I did off of a Philips system here at VCU Health Center. Here we see a lot, again, remember, smaller, larger, right? So here we got a lot of smaller objects that we're bringing into play here. Look how grainy it is. And again, we're doing a cross-sectional slice across the liver and spleen right there. Over here, we go way the opposite direction, and we're now barely seen any, just large objects, a lot of background and so on. And what do you get? A real fuzzy image. So here what I did is I said, let's do a Hanning filter. And with a Hanning filter, we're just going to kind of go down like this. And compared to this graph here, you can see I've introduced a lot more small counts. In other words, all this area up here, this area out here is being excluded, right? So that being noted with this filter, come over here and look, this looks like a more fuzzy image over here because we've cut off some of the higher frequencies. But here, the slope of the curve is not quite as negative, bringing in more data, smaller data, but we're still applying the appropriate cutoff frequency at 0.5 cycles. And look what we have over here. We have a more grainier image, maybe also more detail. Do you like one versus the other? Man, that's really kind of hard to tell, but looks like we got something going on here and also here. And again, I see the objects here, maybe also something in this area of the lobe being photo deficient. And then finally, as far as just for your perusal assessment, I haven't really suggestion. This image I call the beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. And my point being that you and your physician have to sit down and look at the myriad of different ways that you would process the data with different types of filters, with different types of cutoffs, with different types of orders, with different types of critical frequencies, and decide which one do you like, which one do you prefer. You know, is this too grainy? Or maybe I wouldn't look grainy. I think this is too fuzzy. This is too grainy. Yeah, I think that's more fuzzy than grainy. And that's definitely more grainy. Or, you know, which image do you prefer? A Wiener cutoff of 0.5 or a Butterworth cutoff of 0.28? Again, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. And again, it's something that you and your physician needs to actually decide. And that's my assessment, evaluation, discussion, and introduction to SPECT imaging. I want to thank you for listening and wish you all a great day and take care for now. Chat with you again, I'm sure, sometimes real soon. Goodbye for now.